we are so grateful for your many forms of leadership here at Trinity Church, and we're going to dig back into time a little bit today. Feels like a really good thing to do. So,
okay.
Bob.
Okay. Well, first of all, as for John Beach and the ice cream truck, come on. The Beach that I know about would have probably not only supported it, but organized it, and probably been first in line to get the goodies. So, and why was that? Well, because Beach was a man of many dimensions, and he had, among others, he had feet firmly planted in the real world. And not only the theological world, but the real world of life. And I think that is so critically important to understanding him and to understanding our early beginnings, because it set the tone for what came later in many ways. And really, that in turn helps us to deal with our current situation. It helps define us, who we are, and what we believe in, and what's important to us. So, John Beach and the ice cream truck, that's a good introduction. That's a good introduction. Now, what I'm going to present to you is not ice cream, but that's okay. No, I don't need ice cream. I've got water, and I'm all set.
No, who wants something different? Oh, spoon. Thank you. You have a spoon.
You're happy now, Gordy.
Oh, you have.
Okay, Bob's trying to talk.
No, it's okay. It's all right. It's all right.
You sit down, Bob.
It's all right. Are we set? Okay. Now, let me just say this. What I'm going to present, my brief presentation here, is subject to two caveats. One of which is that these are my thoughts alone, because I'm going to put a spin on some things that not all of you may agree with. And that's perfectly okay. Of course, you'd be wrong, but that's all right, too. But that's all right, too. And also, I should say that some of you have heard me speak on this topic before. My remarks this morning are a little bit different than I would have presented in the past. Would have presented 3 or 4 years ago. And there are some additions to those earlier thoughts that I really want to make, and I think are very important to us as we sit here in the 21st century. That's one caveat. And so I take responsibility for the thoughts, but they are a little different in some ways, and I think that'll become apparent as we move on. The second thing is, we're going to have to touch just on a little bit on theology. Now here I am on thin ice.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. So, if you see Reverend Andrea shaking her head or rolling her eyes, you know I've erred. And if by any chance you see her shaking her head and rolling her eyes at the same time,
She skates on thin ice herself.
well, then you understand. Then you know I've really gone off the deep end, and we're all going to be treated to a corrective sermon probably within 2 weeks. So with those two caveats in mind, let's turn the clock back to, well, the first quarter of the 18th century. What was going on? Well, a lot was going on actually around here. First of all, we had 13 colonies. Remember them? From 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 11th grade history, something along those lines. Torture all the way, I'm sure. But these colonies ranged, of course, geographically from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Maine was not part of the picture yet. It was going to come into the Union as a state in 1820, part of the Missouri Compromise. And I mention that only because the compromise was over race and over slavery. Missouri was knocking on the door as a slave state, and you had to balance it off in the Senate by creating a free state. Maine was pried from Massachusetts at that point and came into the Union then. And I mention that because slavery and race have been part and parcel of the American experience, something we oftentimes shy away from, don't want to talk about it, but we can't, in my view. And consequently, what you dealt with then was an attempt to kind of compromise your way out of the slavery issue, and that, we know, was not about to happen. It was not about to happen. So you had the 13 colonies. They were all different. Were they united? No. They've been founded in different ways. Some of them were royal colonies, some of them were proprietary colonies, some of them were joint stock companies. We don't need to go in to discuss all of those. But they were different. There were various attempts to unify them a bit under the crown, and the crown kind of liked it over here, kind of let us do our thing. They were all English. That was fine and dandy. But increasingly, of course, as we move through the 18th century, the crown feels the need for more control. We felt the need for less control, and things evolve as a result of that. So let's take a quick just glimpse at 3 of those colonies: New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, because obviously that's where we are and that's where Newtown is. First, New York. New York was a royal colony. It was basically, we know the story, it was purchased by the British from the Dutch, all those Dutch names up along the Hudson Valley and so forth. And with that came basically royal administration. A lot of local administration? Absolutely. But basically the key was royal administration. And with royal administration, religiously, came the Anglican Church. Makes absolute sense. Now, what was the Anglican Church at that point in the colonies over here? Well, in New York, there were separate, I guess you could call them parishes. They were really missions, and we'll get to that in a moment. And the church was important, but it wasn't a dominant force. Anglicans were not, face it, religious zealots, basically. They were good, solid, pretty much conservative folks who did their thing, were loyal to the king, loyal to the crown, and that was all fine and dandy. Now, I mention that for a number of reasons. First of all, it's important, and one of the reasons it's important theologically, here I go. Andrea, oh, she's over there now. All right. And the main theological point was that was really the apostolic succession. Remember, Henry VIII removed England from the Catholic fold, but kept a couple of critical pieces to it. One was this apostolic succession. The idea that going back to the original apostles, subsequent bishops carried on in a line of continuity forever and ever, and those bishops, of course, drew their support, drew their religious situation from the fact that they were descended from the original apostles by the laying on of hands, by consecration, by everything else. And bishops, of course, in turn ordained, and they did the things that bishops do. Now, that was central to Catholicism. It was also very important to the Anglican Church because Henry VIII had other reasons, basically, for his Reformation. And keeping the apostolic succession was just fine. Now, with that, not a corollary, but a similar thing, and this gets really kind of murky, was the nature of the Eucharist, which we celebrate today, celebrated just a few minutes ago. So was the Eucharist transformational? Did it transform literally or spiritually into the body and blood of Christ? Well, in the Catholic tradition, of course. In the Anglican tradition, yes, of course. But with a few local wrinkles. But it was still transformational. And that's important to understand. So you had apostolic succession, and you had basically this transformational nature of the Eucharist, which was celebrated in the Anglican churches, of which we are a part today, indirectly. Now, so that put New York to the side. New York was over there, in the Hudson Valley, west of Danbury, everything was good. In the next stop would be Massachusetts. Now, if we didn't have great religious zealotry in this founding in New York, we sure did in Massachusetts. And these guys were, of course, the Puritans, going back to the 1600s. Plymouth, we all know that remarkable little mythological story. And followed 10 years later by the founding of Massachusetts Bay in the Boston area. Massachusetts Bay Colony was stronger and bigger, and it absorbed Plymouth, and so basically they came together. Now, basically, without going into this too deeply, the original Puritans because they were out to purify the existing church. What was the existing church? The Anglican Church and anybody else around. Some were separatists. You had to separate from the church completely. Some were non-separatists. Maybe the church could be purified from within. Well, the separatists were basically the ones who came over here. And they were followers of John Calvin. And they brought two distinct streams with them. One was a very democratic stream. Predestination was the order of the day in terms of salvation. We don't need to go down that route in particular. But the idea was that God was really ripping mad. God was wrathful. He wasn't happy. And what was he mad about? Well, basically everything. Everything that humanity had done since the creation, which was a lot. And particularly, he was mad at the existing state of churches. But God, after all, was really a good guy. So he agreed to save a few people. Everybody else was damned for eternity. But he would save a few people. Now, who would he save? Well, those who believed in this stuff. So, assume that we all are fervent believers in this. I look around, none of us would be, but that's okay, starting with me. But fervent believers, so we all believe here we're saved. Anybody outside there is not saved. They're damned for eternity. But we are saved, and life is good. Now, among us, since we're all saved, we're all equal. Nobody's more equally saved than anybody else. Now, that's good. That's a good democratic tradition. But we have to worry about our salvation, because what if we're not saved? Well, the alternative is not very pleasant. So they had this two streams that were very inward-looking and very ugly in a way, and very democratic at the same time. So you founded communities, and when they came to Massachusetts and later to Connecticut, those two streams kind of collided. So you had equality among us. So we would all take votes and on issues, theological issues to a degree, but also community issues, because these were separate communities, popped all over the place, and they didn't have much communication. There was no great interest in having a hierarchy, because the Calvinists and the Puritans did not believe in that. The church had to be restored to its original state, which was really pretty basic, and that was the way it was. So we would make decisions, community decisions, and that called for a town meeting, democratic. Called for votes, democratic. Only votes among us, of course. And so that democratic tradition was kind of born. We need educated people. We need colleges to provide leaders, ministers, not priests, but ministers who will lead us. And so we create a college. Let's call it Harvard, 1636. Later in Connecticut, Yale, a little bit later. Provide ministers for the flock. And because we worry about our children, it's the responsibility of all of us to create schools for those children and educate them in the public fashion, because we as a community owe that obligation. So we create public education. Anyway, that's fine. Now, the other side of the coin was, of course, anybody on the outside of the wall here is in really bad shape. And do we associate with them? Not if we can help it. We don't encourage them to come. We don't particularly want them. It's difficult. And when we see little signals of misbehavior or whatever, that could be a real bad sign. That can lead in this extreme condition to the Salem witch trials. It can lead to Hester Prynne in fiction. Not a pretty picture. And who's more damned above all Well, Native Americans, boy, are they damned. They have their own culture. We've got to clean that up. And so we take them on. Well, why not? They're damned. And what also could be even worse than them? How about Africans who were brought in 1619 in Virginia as slaves? Any Africans who come in, man, are they at the bottom of the heap and deserve to be kept there because they're absolutely damned. Okay, enough of that. That's enough. That's enough. All right. So Connecticut was founded by basically those guys in the 1600s. They filtered down from Massachusetts and settled in eastern Connecticut, up the Connecticut River Valley to Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield, places like that. But eastern Connecticut became an early hotbed of this, and it led to some brutal Indian wars in the first part, and mid-part, really, of the 1600s. As for western Connecticut, well, we were closer to New York. And at a distance from there, we had the Connecticut River Valley, which was nice fertile land, great for tobacco growing in the 20th century, by the way. Connecticut shade-grown tobacco, the best is what I understand. And but western Connecticut evolved more slowly, so that by the early 1700s, there wasn't a great deal going on here. Newtown came into existence in the early 1700s. Was it religious zealotry? Was it pious people determined to do it? No, it was a bunch of land speculators who got permission of the general court to buy land. Who'd you buy it from? Well, the peaceful Putatucks, who were different than their brethren east of the Connecticut River, who had been by this point pretty much decimated, but were pretty fierce. And so the general court in Hartford, after a few fits and starts, gave permission to a whole bunch of land speculators, not a whole bunch, but several, to buy up land and to purchase it basically from the local tribes, which they did. A lot of muskets and flints and other kind of trinkets and the usual stuff went by the boards. There were two big land purchases, one for basically the central part of Newtown, where we are today, and the other later for Sandy Hook. So the town of Newtown, by about 1710, evolved as a huge, rather amorphous place that needed organization. And of course, one of the ways you organize was to bring in the now called Congregational Church, the direct descendants of the Puritans, softer, thank God for that, but still in terms of organization, congregational. The congregation, the individual congregation, was the key and made communal decisions. Big on town meetings, big on communal decision making. So you had a Congregational Church formed in Newtown. And there were a couple of fits and starts. They brought in a couple of guys. One turned out not to be ordained. That was a bit embarrassing, but who knows? Who cares? And in the year 1724, the town was still pretty new. They reached out. They needed a new minister, and they hired a guy named John Beach, congregational minister. Beach, what do we know about him? Well, he grew up in Stratford. And that was important because there was a small Anglican community in Stratford, and Beach had been exposed to them. We also knew that he was, as I say, young. He'd been born in 1700. He was 24 years old and gets his first shot at Newtown. He'd gone to Yale. He was a graduate in 1721, so he'd been well-versed in congregational theology and came into town as a minister. Well, he was a hot shot from the word go. This guy had it. Theologically, he had it. But more importantly, he had personal qualities which really leapt forward. He would have led the ice cream truck, as I just said. But he had a great ability to lead. Wasn't something that seemed to evolve over time, where he slowly developed leadership qualities and ebbed and flowed. No, he just had it from the word go. Now, what kind of leadership was this? Well, it was leadership by example. It was also leadership by bringing people together. It was leadership by understanding that people had complex emotions, complex needs, and that you dealt with those things by dealing with them on their own level. Now, that was extremely important. Because Newtown, remember, it's a huge town. You've got all these different communities, so you have different people, and you think of all the congregations getting together and having wonderful town meetings, and everybody's, in great shape. No, there were disputes all over the place. The people from Hawleyville had problems with people in Sandy Hook, and it was just messy. Beach was able to bridge that as congregational minister and as town leader. And he also immersed himself, he had to, in the affairs of the town. Now and he was extraordinarily popular. People loved him, they respected him, probably a few feared him, but he did this. He was able to pull this off right from the get-go. Okay, that was wonderful. By the way, another thing happened to Beach, which was lovely in his own personal life. He had a girlfriend. We don't know much about her. And he married in 1726 in Stratford. Nice. So he was really popular. A new bride, and he was very popular in town. All that was great, and his ministry was growing in town, and the town was thriving. It was unifying. But Beach reached a personal crisis. He had a personal crisis, and it was over theology. Basically, he came to doubt the validity of his ordination. And why? Well, I think part of it was his association with Anglicans in Stratford, growing up probably, and also the fact that when he was at Yale, the bastion of congregational orthodoxy, there was a movement, a brief movement, which was quickly suppressed, to have some Anglican persuasion, at least exposure in. I love the Anglican persuasion exposure. Boy, I'm really good this morning. At Yale, as I say, quickly suppressed, but there was some upheaval, and Beach was exposed to that. So Beach came to the conclusion at some point that the Anglican orders, that is the apostolic succession and the nature of the Eucharist, were critical to him. And the fact that the congregational model, the Eucharist was ceremonial rather than transformational, did not do it for him. And that must have been a brutal thing for him. I also think there's something else that nobody talks about, and I think that Beach personally looked at what was going on in Newtown and the difficulties of leading with all these disparate communities and so many people, that the model of community decision-making was tough, and you had tough to get things done. And he got things done. And by the way, he usually had a clear vision of what he wanted to do and got people to go to it. One of his great strengths. But I think that was probably weighing on him. So in any case, the short story is, of course, he decided to take holy orders in the Anglican Church, which was complicated. First of all, you don't just get up and say one morning, announce to the body politic, hey, I'm an Anglican now, and we're going to have another church. It didn't work that way. You obviously had to get ordained. Remember the structure, that apostolic succession. You had to get ordained. Well, go find a bishop and get ordained, for crying out loud. Well, that's fine, except there were no bishops over here. Let's not forget that. The Anglican Church and the general interest of control had no interest in sending bishops to the colonies here or any of the other colonies, because that basically, you kind of lost control over that, political control as well as religious. So who ran the show over here for the Anglicans? Well, the Missionary Society of the Anglican Church, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. An interesting organization, founded in 1701. And they basically ran the show in the colonies here or any other colonies. And the empire was growing, of course, at that point. So basically, all Anglican parishes over here in Westchester and Rhodes were basically missions. And the clergy were missionaries. Now, who are the clergy? Well, they were guys sent from England as missionaries. The occasional person over here, crazy enough to want to become an Anglican minister, therefore had to go to England to get ordained, to go through the hoops, get ordained. Not an easy proposition. Beach made the decision to do it. And he and his wife and young son now That must have been interesting domestic discussions over that one. Embarked for England sometime around 1730, a little bit later. Went to England and propositioned basically the Society for the Gospel, would you be willing to ordain me? There's no sure thing. They said, yeah, okay. So he went through the hoops that you had to go through, all the training and everything, and was ordained in Scotland, actually, because the English and Scottish Church were okay on that, and was ordained by a bishop, and now, under the auspices of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, they sent him back as a missionary. Where did they send him? Newtown. And you might say, good luck, John. Good luck. You left, it wasn't good enough for you, and now you're back. Well, the society felt that probably that Newtown was ripe for an Anglican settlement. Closer to New York, closer to Stratford, that time is right. Beach, you're going back. So back he came. And in 1732, preached his famous first sermon down here at the corner of Glover Avenue and Main Street as now an Anglican minister and missionary from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts. Fine. All right. Now that could have been a disaster from the first day, but it wasn't, because John Beach was John Beach. I think it probably also happened, I have a sneaking suspicion, that the congregational ministers who followed him may have been kind of duds, but I don't know about that. But when he came back, an awful lot of people were mighty glad to see him. Even if he was an Anglican, well, he's an Anglican, what's that? I don't know, but he's now back, and we're going to follow him. And so consequently, Trinity got off the ground right away, if that's when we consider our beginnings, which we probably should, in that first sermon and first celebration of the Eucharist. Got off on a pretty decent start with local people. Yeah, I like Beach, I'm going to go with him. And other people said, he's going papist, we're not going to do that. So the town was the town split? Yeah, it was. Was it a schism? Yeah. But as it turned out, there were room for both persuasions, and a key to the salvation of everybody, I believe, was John Beach. Because he played his cards so well. The guy knew how to do it. He knew how to reach out to the Congregationalists, who were probably afraid of losing more members. And at the same time, he didn't glorify Anglicanism any more than he did personally, and kept things in line, and Newtown, as a result, instead of falling apart, coalesced. And I think that was extremely important because, and this is on the political front, on the religious front, and various other things, because, as we know now, that things were not going to be easy down the road. We're approaching relationships with London, which are not going to be pleasant and are ultimately going to result in the American War for Independence, of course. So that's all factoring in and accelerating more quickly, particularly after 1765. So here's Beach building the situation. And he's doing a great job of it. First church was built soon after, basically, I would say soon after the first sermon, but shortly thereafter. I think it was huge. I think it was 24 by 26 feet, something like that. Figured that one out. What's this room? Anyway, wasn't terribly big, but that's all right. Before long, a second church followed, and then ultimately a third wooden structure was built and basically consecrated in 1793 by Samuel Seabury, the first bishop. And that lasted until 1870 when this building was built. So things marched on. Now, I'm going to move a little bit away from normally a great many details about John Beach at this point. He had a large family. His first wife died, unfortunately, but he remarried in 1756 and had a good family life with real position of leadership in the town. Political leadership, yeah, and also spiritual leadership. Now, very important here, remember, when he was ordained, he had to take an oath of loyalty to the king. Because who was head of the Anglican Church? The king was, basically. Who's the head of the Anglican Church today? Well, King Charles, I guess. He's claiming that he's the head of all religions. Well, good move, Charles. Good move, Charles. Good political move. But technically, the head of the Anglican Church was and is the British monarch. So he'd taken an oath of loyalty to the British monarch, and you had to pray for the monarch, of course, in church on every Sunday. That was part of the ritual. That's part of the Eucharist. That's part of everything. So as things are falling apart, here's John Beach praying for the British monarch in every service. You can't avoid that. Furthermore, you were praying for it in two places by now because Beach was very popular, and the folks in Reading decided they wanted a church too. So the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel said, Beach, well, okay, you found a church down there too, and you can do two, by the way. So take care of it. Which he did somehow. Remarkable. The guy had incredible energy. And a horse, yes. I used to commute down Poverty Hollow Road, and there were some gamey mornings and evenings of commutation in the winter. And this when I was cursing my lot. I must admit, occasionally I thought of John Beach, and I said, I don't think Guy missed a Sunday. He did this on horseback, for crying out loud. So shape up and go up and get your way to Reading Ridge somehow, and beyond. But Beach did that, and his popularity grew, and his fame grew. He was invited to preach as far away as New Jersey, for crying out loud. And Anglicans loved him. He was a great early force in the Anglican Church, and a powerhouse, but most important, a powerhouse here because he kept the act together. All right. All that was fine until, of course, the American Revolution broke out, and then you really got complications. Because these communities here, particularly in the western part of the state, were kind of fractured. You had a strong loyalist contingent. You had a strong, for lack of a better term, patriot contingent. And Beach somehow, again, managed to keep the ship going. He managed to preach throughout, praying for the king, and expressing his loyalty to the king, while at the same time breaking bread with and keeping faith with the other guys, our guys, if you want to look at it that way. Don't forget, this wasn't easy. You had what was it, 1781, or 1778, I guess it was, 1779. You had the encampment at Putnam State Park, what's now General Putnam. That was a tough patriot encampment. And meanwhile, down the road a few miles, Beach is praying for the king. How do you do that? And how do you do that and manage to do it? Well, I would suggest you do it carefully. But he managed to pull it off. I mean, you have the wonderful stories of patriots coming to disrupt a service, and he says, boys, why don't you just stack your muskets over there in the corner and join us? And they said, okay, I guess we better do that. So they did. And then somebody took a shot, theoretically, at him in Reading, not here, at him when he was preaching, and he said some solemn words and said, we're going to keep going, and did. Ducked, I'm sure, but kept going. So there was all that marvelous stuff. But the great thing was, I think about Beach, was that he was a unifier. He was very, very forward-looking. He was very broad in his perspective about people. And for all of his Anglicanism, he was also an includer, so that he could work the sides of many streets very, very skillfully and come up okay. Now, he died in 1782, which was a year before the conclusion of the war, the Battle of Yorktown, Treaty of Paris, and so forth. So he never lived to see the end of the Revolutionary War. Now, what kind of legacy did he leave? Because when the war ended, the Anglican Church was in absolute tatters. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel said, okay, you guys, we're leaving. The Crown leaves, we leave, see ya, good luck. And hopefully you'll fold. And an awful lot of places folded. I mean, people in Westchester, oh my Lord, people fled. They were fearful of retribution. we're Americans. We don't do that particularly well. We're not the French in 1789 for crying out loud. But a lot of people fled back to England, couldn't face it, went to Nova Scotia. But the Anglican Church was a colossal mess with churches closing all over the place. But not Trinity. Trinity did not quit. And Trinity Beach was no longer with us, but he left the place ready to move forward, and he did. Had he not left it in that kind of shape, we might not be sitting here today. Or we might be sitting here in a different modus operandi. And so, as a result, when the dust is settled and the Episcopal Church emerged, with Samuel Seabury being our first bishop, of course, Trinity was ready to pick things up. That's one of the reasons I think why Seabury shows up in 1793 to consecrate a first church here, not the third Trinity Church building. And consequently, the tone was set, and the tone included some of Beach's thoughts. Forward-looking, rolling with the flow, don't get stuck in terms of, conservative, hopeless, backward-looking theology and will never move from anything. The idea that the Gospels could indeed be revolutionary, or rather revolutionary documents if you think about them, and that basically you are include and you build on inclusion and you reach outward and you have to be willing to communicate with issues of the day, secular issues, as well as religious ones. And I think that legacy is crucially important, and we thank God for that, and we celebrate John Beach, and we darn well should. Now, having said all that good stuff, let's move on to something else. And this, I think, is important for us. And I won't take much of your time, but this deals with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, of which we've made many references. Remember, they were the missionary society. They provided support. They provided everything to keep the Anglican Church and Trinity Church going. John Beach was a great missionary for the society. He sent back voluminous reports all the time to the society, detailing what he was doing, how everything was going, and he was a good, loyal missionary. And in fact, that is, all right, this is his inscription on his tombstone in the Newtown Village Cemetery, where he rides with us today. Here lieth interred the earthly remains of the Reverend John Beach, A.M., late missionary from the Venerable Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, who exchanged this life for mortality on the 19th day of March, 1782, in the 52nd year of his ministry. The Venerable Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Now, we as a church here, over the years, have kept that Venerable Society with the word venerable pretty much in mind. We've acknowledged its importance in terms of our founding. We've acknowledged that it had a great to do with our success, our support, up until the end of the war, everything. And we've made no bones about this. We've celebrated it and kept it in reverent thought and in a couple of ways, deed. I'm getting to this thing. Well, okay, that's great. And how have we done that visually? Well, in a couple of ways. For one thing, the society had I'm going to call it a coat of arms, or at least a symbolic rendition of who it was, who it stood for, what it stood for, and the kinds of things that you would put on a visual presentation. And we, in the years that I've been at Trinity, kind of relished that, or at least venerated it. We didn't think much about it. That's the problem. And most visually, it was downstairs. When you get on the first floor by the elevator, just below us here, there's a sign which says 1732 to 1965. 1965 because that was the parish house dedication. All right. In the middle, you'll see a large oval hole went in the hole. Well, the plaque, I guess we could call it that, which was the rendition of the seal of the Society for the Propagation of Foreign Parts. Okay. It was up there for years. We didn't think about that. I mean, it was, hey, this is great. These were our guys. Well, the seal itself needed some repair. So it was taken down with the idea of restoring it and then putting it right back up to its appropriate place. But in the process, it kind of disappeared for a few years. And ultimately, we found it again, brought it back with the idea of restoring it and probably putting it up. That is, until we looked at it. Now, coincidental to this, we also began looking at a little more about the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Who are they? Great guys. Well, yeah, but then we made an interesting discovery that the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel obviously needed money to support and fund all these churches and do all the good missionary work and convert and, basically convert the heathen and all that kind of stuff. It was a little embarrassing, but okay. Where did they get the money? Well, they got it from a variety of sources, because they were fairly well heeled. But one place where they really got money was slavery. And particularly a slave plantation in Barbados, a sugar plantation. Now, in fairness to them, they didn't found it. It was kind of willed to them. But when it was willed to them, did they say, we've got to shut this down, we can't do this? No, they said, this is great. Now we've gotten really crank up all the revenue from this sugar plantation to fund our activities in places like Newtown, Connecticut. And as a result, slaves, of course, did the work. So they were slave owners, and not apologetic slave owners either. So I guess we would raise the question, did Trinity Church benefit from slavery? Is that part of our legacy? And I would have to say, absolutely. And something we shouldn't shy away from. What we do with that, I'm not sure. So at the same time, I'm going to be over this in just a second, we had the plaque. So we're thinking of the slavery thing, and then we look at the plaque, and we're saying, oh, God, what is this all about? Furthermore, to give you a further idea of how we venerated all this stuff, I had, here we go. We had book plates. Book plates went into books in this library. What's on the book plate? Trinity Church, Newtown, Connecticut, and here is the seal for the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. All right, that's our legacy. Oh, goody, you know. These aren't going to see the light of day. If you're interested in taking one, please feel free, because there's not going to be any reprint of this stuff. I can assure you of that. So here we have, let's see if I can do this delicately without knocking it over. Here we have this beautiful seal of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was and there it is. So if you look at it, you'll see a couple of things that we've looked at. Here come the missionaries. Boy, are they ready to roll. Who do we have over here? Well, I'm not sure. Is it us? Are they Native Americans? Are they slaves? We're not sure. Whoever they are, they're on the receiving end. And what are they saying? Are they saying, please, come, save us, destroy our culture, it's okay. And if when you're through that, if you've still got a little time on your hands, why not enslave us too? Because we'd like that. Is that what they're really saying? I don't know. But whatever they're saying, they're not saying it to us in any direct way anymore. We cannot put this plaque up. Now, what do we do with it? I don't know. That's for all of us. Basically, you've got some decisions making. I think it's a wonderful educational tool myself. But it's part of our legacy. Now, I'm not going to carry this much farther, but I would suggest this. And I think we have to have more conversations about this stuff. And we have to have more conversations about slavery as a whole, because I'll just leave you with this thought. Did slavery exist in Connecticut? Absolutely. Newport, Rhode Island was a capital port of the slave trade early on. When did the last slaves leave Connecticut? In the 1830s, something like that. Did slavery exist in Newtown? Yeah, sure. Why not? Why not? Somewhere on the list here, I've got my many pages of relevant information, a list of slave owners. These were slave owners in Newtown. Quite a bunch, including some really interesting names here. A lot of Curtises, Botsfords, Booths, and Glovers. I'll leave that one for your thoughts. Early Glovers, that is. Including a guy named Philo Curtis. We named a road after him. We named a road after Philo Curtis, as well as one after John Beach, so that kind of keeps things open. So that's part of our legacy, and we have to deal with it. Now, was Beach, we don't know where Beach stood on a lot of things. But was he a slave owner? No, absolutely not. Did he baptize slaves? Yeah, but he took pride in it. But does that all this stuff reduce his legacy to us? I say absolutely not. And what for us? What do we do with this information? Do we feel ashamed? Do we deal in white shame, which seems to be a wonderful political watchword these days? I say absolutely not. But what I do say, I think we would be ashamed, would come our way if we did not acknowledge this and learn about it and learn from it. So as we move forward, particularly with our attitudes toward inclusion around here, very much in the Beach spirit, I would suggest. I think you'd approve of our signs. We cannot do that without acknowledging and learning from our past, and I think that should go to schools and everywhere else too. So you kind of know where I'm coming from on that. As for this, I would simply say that at a time when we are putting up signs promoting and encouraging our inclusiveness, that we can't have those signs up there and then have somebody come into the building and see this and say, oh, but by the way, we give great reverence and support to an organization which had slaves and was part of our legacy. No, I don't think we can do that. We can't do that. So on that note, I think this is basically a conversation which we should all continue as a parish. And I have no solutions. I'm not telling you what to believe, how important it is to you, but I think it's important to have the conversations, and it's important not to shy away from the reality. And on that note, I will stop. And thank you very much for your time and for your, I think, ability to concentrate on what I was saying. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Take a look at this. It's interesting.